right. So now I remember back in foundations or the first semester when we saw linear equations, when we graph a line, one thing we talk about was a slope. The word slope should ring a bell. And then we call it a constant change. Remember that again in foundations, remember that in first semester. Now, constant change. So that's basically what happens when we have a linear. So here, I'm gonna just give you a list. We call this a sequence, but just for us to remember how things were when we were graphing points, these are your y values. Remember how there was an x and a y value to graph a point? These are your y values, and we're gonna call this a sequence. So now here I'm asking for each sequence state if it's a linear, exponential, or neither. So linear, like I mentioned right now, linear is the constant change. So this means that we're adding, I'm gonna just say add the same. I'm gonna write add same. So for each number, I either add or subtract the same thing. So if that's happening, I call that a linear. Now, exponential in this case, I'm going to write multiplied. I'm going to write a little dot for multiplication, and I'm going to say I multiply the same number. So in order for me to go from one number to the other, I multiply by the same thing. And my multiplication happens to be the same thing. So let's take a look at question number 1. From 0 to 3, the first thing I ask myself is it linear? I'm going to check if it's linear. In order for me to get from 0 to 3, I have to add 3, right? 0 plus 3 gives me 3. And then I'm going to check plus 3, and then plus 3 to see if that works. If it works, if I'm adding the same thing, this sequence is linear. And I check 0 plus 3 is 3. It works. 3 plus 3 is 6. It works. 6 plus 3 is 9. 9 plus 3 is 12. So it seems like I keep on adding or sometimes subtracting. So I add or subtract the same. So I'm going to call this linear. Let's take a look at question number 2. In order for me to go from negative 320 to negative 80, I'm going to have to add 240. So then I check on the next one. Again, I'm checking if this is linear. I'm going to see if it works. I want to see if I keep on adding 240 and to see if it works. Negative 320 plus 240 is equal to negative 80. Good. Negative 80 plus 240 equals negative 20. I don't think so. Okay. So in this case, it is not linear. Like I said, that's the first thing that I do. Check if it's linear, check if you're adding or subtracting the same thing. Now, if it is not linear, let me check if it is exponential. I either multiplied or divide by the same thing. So from negative 320 to become negative 80, I have to divide this by 4. So I'm going to see if dividing by 4 continues working all the way through. Negative 80 divided by 4, it works. Negative 20 divided by 4 is negative 5, so it works. Negative 5 divided by 4 is negative 5 over 4. Yeah, it works. Remember, a fraction is division, so just tell me 5 divided by 4. So I keep on multiplying or dividing by the same thing. So I'm going to call this exponential. On your homework, it's going to be a multiple choice. So we know that linear, I add or subtract the same thing. Exponential, I multiply or divide the same thing all the way. Now, sometimes it's not linear, sometimes it's not exponential, so I'm going to call that neither. Let's take a look at question number 3. I check if it is exponential, linear. For 1 to become 4, I have to add 3. 4 plus 3 is not 9. Okay, so again, if it was linear, I will be adding the same thing. It is not linear, so it doesn't work. Now let me check if it is exponential, multiplying or dividing. In order for 1 to become 4, I have to multiply by 4, right? Because 1 times 4 is 4. But then I go 4 times 4, I go times 4 all the way across. Right? 4 times 4 is not 9, so it's not exponential either. Notice how I check if it is linear. Notice I check if it is exponential. If it is neither of the two, then I'm going to call this neither. All right, so we saw an example of each. Let's take a look at number 4. I want to check linear. I ask myself, in order for -2 to become -4, I have to subtract 2, right? -2 minus 2 is -4. So I'm going to write -2 all the way to see if it's linear. -4 minus 2 is not -8, so it doesn't work. It's not linear. Let me check if it is exponential, multiplied or divide by the same thing. In order for -2 to become -4, I have to multiply this by 2. Let me check if multiplying by 2 works all the way. Then I check. -4 times 2 is -8. It works. -8 times 2 is -16. It works. -16 times 2 is -32. So I'm multiplying by the same thing. I'm going to call this exponential. So again, really quick, if you add or subtract by the same thing all the way across, linear. If you multiply or divide by the same thing, exponential. Now, if it is not linear and it's not exponential, we call that neither.